Yes. How often are we completely inept at using our own technology? Not good.
Okay, so shall I get started then? Yeah.
Yep.
Right. Yes, so this is a fairly high-level session. So as has already been said, so I'll be going through some slides about the kind of slightly more technical aspects of Cortex, and then I'll hand over to Nolene, who'll talk about some of the kind of more information management, information governance aspects. So like I said, this is very high level. I'm going to do my best to not overtalk. So that's a challenge for me. And as Purdy's already said, please just shout out or put your hands up if you've got a question along the way, because we want to make this as interactive as possible, so it's really useful. So we try not to make this into something where basically I just show you PowerPoint. Okay, so let me get started. So Cortex, essentially you didn't think of. So as I go on, you'll detect a definite theme of what I'm talking about here. So let's do the first slide. So what is this thing called Project Cortex? So it's this kind of like this mythical phrase that's been bandied around for actually quite a while, a year or so. So what I've done is I've actually gone to the Microsoft marketing machine to see what they're saying, and I pulled out two key phrases, in particular some keywords within those two phrases. So the first one to say is, so Project Cortex itself isn't a piece of technology. It's more of a wider initiative, which is about using artificial intelligence technology. And again, as you see, Microsoft described it there, it's about empowering people to use the app they use every day. So that's the key word in Project Cortex, artificial intelligence. Yes. The other key paragraph, which I pulled out there, again, has some very important words, and it's saying it's building on content services. So what we're saying here is, so this isn't some new thing. It's leveraging the existing SharePoint, the existing kind of content repositories that you might already have in Microsoft 365. And again, the idea there is that it helps streamline the way you manage processes, security, compliance, and your workflow. So that's Cortex. So Cortex isn't a kind of a product, an application in itself. So Syntex is the first actual product you can use. So that's what Syntex is about. So Syntex is the concrete implementation. So essentially, Syntex uses that AI, which is inside Project Cortex, and it's about teaching and amplification of the things that human beings already do, and in particular at scale. So Syntex is aimed at kind of like mass classification of documents at a scale at which a human being wouldn't be able to do very, very quickly or easily. So how does this all start to work? So Syntex is a piece of technology that you have to train. So basically, you have to train it to start to understand context as if Syntex was an expert itself. And what we mean by train is, so ultimately, the final outcome of that is tagging your content automatically. But there's some work here. You have to do some training. So the other thing Syntex does is, like I said, it automates how you do that. And again, one of the phrases that you see quite often is it's about transforming that content into knowledge. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about raw information, and by application of automatic tagging, you then turn that information into knowledge, which you can then use. Syntex is also there to reduce information black holes. So we've all seen them. We've all had repositories where we stick some documents in them, and those documents never see the light of day again. So Syntex is helping you tag that content so it can come to the surface more easily. So it doesn't just like go away and never comes back again. Right, let me do a little bit more detail. Let me go into the next slide. So first thing is, this artificial intelligence stuff, it does not happen by magic. There are a number of things you need to do as system implementers, as subject matter experts, as information architects. So one of the first things you need to think about is, what content centers are you going to apply Syntex to? A content center is essentially a bespoke kind of SharePoint site, which is provisioned by Syntex, and that's where you load your content into. So that's the first thing. So you need to decide some grouping of your content in order to make Syntex work. Syntex also requires the definition of a set of certain key information artifacts, and those are there on the fourth bullet. So you need to define what models you have. You need to define explanation types, and you need to define this other artifact called an extractor. And I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail in a second. Yeah. So what this means is you actually need some human expertise here. So you need to have a human being, a subject matter expert, to define the framework in which Syntex operates, and then define the framework in which Syntex runs. So there is no magic hat, there is no magic that can be applied, which just makes that application of that artificial intelligence possible. So more specifically, you need to think about what existing metadata you have. So what I'm talking about there is what content types, what columns, what term sets you have in your existing information estate. So how are you using content types, columns, and term sets within SharePoint and indeed Teams and the wider Microsoft 365 environment? So Syntex can create entirely new pieces of metadata, or actually it can leverage existing metadata that you have already.
Mark?
Yep.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Werner,
yes.
No, Werner's got a question.
Sorry,
well, it's not so much a question. I understood that Syntex actually is also able to build upon, so you need those content centers, but you can also build on existing content types. So if you already have indeed metadata, you need to teach it that this is the new Syntex metadata, but you can continue to build on that one. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. So one of the decisions you have to take is you have to think, am I going to apply Syntex to my content from scratch and get Syntex to derive those content types, columns automatically, or are you going to merge your existing content types and columns into what Syntex also builds out?
Yeah.
And so because Syntex is not going to operate by itself independently. Mostly people will have existing content repositories with existing information architectures. So in other words, content types and columns. And you need to think about how you're going to kind of merge all that together, because otherwise Syntex will just become some separate island of understanding, a separate island of tagging, which isn't integrated everywhere else. So that's one of the things you need to be mindful of, the integration with the existing regime. Let me just go into the next slide. Yeah, so the next bullet. So again, basically, it's recapping what you said, which is you typically apply Syntex to new content. So you've trained Syntex with your documents, and then once the artificial intelligence model is there, you need to apply it to other content. So in other words, it needs to be tagged automatically. So essentially, you train. There's a train phase and there's a use phase. So the train phase is you have to supply training documents. But the key thing here is an expert has to mediate what training documents you want to apply. And also the expert has to instruct Syntex how it could be trained. So that training process essentially produces those three artifacts I talked about there, which is the model, the explanation types. And then, so once you've got that kind of intelligence built up, you then apply it to your existing content, to apply it to existing content. And here the diagram just shows Microsoft 365 documents, but it can be used to process PDFs, and it can be used to process raw text.
Yep.
Shall I go on? Yeah. No questions?
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. So let's go to a little bit more detail here. So what are these key information architects I keep talking about? So the first one is you've got to define the model. So here, the documents you use to train on Syntex are really important. And in particular, you've got to choose documents which exhibit negative and positive examples of the thing you're trying to train. So here, you need a subject matter expert, because you can't just throw some documents at Syntex. You have to know what are good and bad examples of the thing you're trying to train it in. So that requires human expertise. You also, as part of the training process, building up the model, you need to get the expert to essentially say when those negatives and positives apply. And again, this is already mentioned through Werner's comment question, you need to figure out how those labels, so in other words, how that metadata gets integrated with your existing information architecture. You also optionally need to define these constructs called explanation types. And explanation types really consist of those three things which I've listed. Firstly, phrase lists. So what words, phrases do you currently use in your information that you want to identify within your documents you're going to train? So again, a human being has to define what those words are in order to make the training work properly. You have to say, this list of words are things that I want Syntex to try and understand. In the same token, you have this construct called a pattern list. So this is, whereas a phrase list is textual things to identify, a pattern list tends to be things like credit card numbers or dates, or maybe other kind of identifiers of various kinds. And then the third thing you need to help Syntex define is the proximity. So you need to describe what certain content means when it's next to other content. So for example, you might say when a number is next to a street name, then that number probably means it's the name of the house on that street. So again, quite a few things to define. And then finally, you need to define these set of things called extractors. And extractors really are a bridge between the model you've defined, so the model you've trained using your content, and the explanation types. And the extractors are basically specific examples. So you might have a pattern list which says, this is how you identify a date in my content, but the extractor might say, I've defined a thing called contract expiry date. And again, a human being has to say, this is a good example of a contract expiry date in your content. So an expert has to go in and actually highlight those individual words in your training content. So if you're getting the sense that actually that's quite a bit of work, you're right, because this training doesn't just happen. So you need to define all those key information architects, models, explanation types, etc. And in particular, you have to go into quite a lot of detail inside a training set to identify what they are. And all this means, in other words, you need an information architecture. So you need to have some sense of what your content types are, what your term sets are, what your columns are, and all the things that surround that. So again, a good Microsoft 365 information architecture will contain all the things which Cortex needs to do a good job, but it will contain other things. So some sense about what the site and library structures are, some sense about how you want search to operate, how you want the navigation of content to be done. And again, actually two things which are particularly important, which Syntex can't really help you with yet, is what is the access control model? So how users going to access and what permissions they're going to have. And in particular, what kind of retention and disposal regime applies to all this content. So that means there's quite a bit of work to be done. And then finally, my last slide is, okay, so how do I actually implement this stuff? And I've really pulled out 3 key points here. Firstly, you need some experts. So what I'm saying here is to use automatic syntax requires some manual work up front, some definitions. It needs training work, which your subject matter experts have to be used for, and it needs some information architecture to define what your information architecture is. So again, I think I don't need to emphasize it. You need this information architecture because you need to define the relevant aspects of syntax, but also you need to keep the model trained and updated, because as you add new content, that AI modeling itself needs to change in the light of that new content. So in other words, you don't just train it and then it's done forever. You've got to keep that training updated, keep refreshing it with content as it appears. And then lastly, again, pulling out some of the comments, in particular what Werner was saying before, you've got to think about how Syntex is going to integrate. So how does it integrate with existing information architecture? How does it integrate with your existing governance regime, which Nolin's going to talk about in a second? And again, how it integrates your existing information management processes. So again, it's not a magic trick. It is clever, but you do need some manual effort, some manual definition from experts. Any questions on any of that?
No, it's very quiet, Mark. I think everybody's really impressed.
Or they're trying to find the right button, huh?
Yes. It's a little hand. You could also do this. Turn on the camera and wave.
Yep. So before we go to Nolien, now it's the time to ask questions. So go ahead if you have any. Otherwise, we will just move on.
I hope you're not all dumbfounded.
Yeah, it's good to realize that even though there is indeed artificial intelligence, which is smart and gets smarter the more you train it, you need to train it, as Mark clearly says, and also the information that you're gonna feed it to train. Right, you need to think about how to do that. Otherwise, it becomes an aisle. Actually, I thought it was a very nice remark. It wouldn't be the first time that. Well, not so much an artificial intelligence one, but a sort of knowledge management network has been created, or location has been created, and it works, but it's an owl. So as I said, also with the questions on the support, you need to go to another system with another login, etc. And you don't want that. You want it in one location, and actually you want it everywhere. So it becomes smarter than you actually are and knows what you want. Cool.
Yeah, let's
maybe.
Yep.
Shall I move on then? So there we go. So essentially, from my perspective, the challenge that every organization faces is the ongoing management and governance of their unstructured information. So it's not just the implementing of something new today, but it's how does this continue and manifest itself going forward. And I define governance as the processes, rules, roles, controls, standards, and related guidance and training needed to ensure a digital workplace remains both successful and sustainable going forward. The volume of all the information that we're creating is increasing exponentially, which is really placing an additional burden on both our users and our organizations. And while information managers can ask users to use structures that they've created, apply metadata that they've defined within the controls that they've set, but at the end of the day, we're still experiencing massive issues with the implementation and with information management within SharePoint. And some of these are around the continued existence of disconnected silos of information, information management activities like tagging, applying the right permissions, retention rules are all labor intensive. Managing metadata and taxonomies is also labor intensive and often not really consistently applied by our users, if indeed they do apply the metadata. Applying compliance by, deleting documents is still a massive challenge for most organizations, because organizations are really risk averse and nobody likes to take a decision to delete anything. And all with this massive information is still leading to massive challenges around discovery, and particularly being confident that you've retrieved all the information that you need, or indeed it's the most up-to-date information. And what that leads to is this increase in siloing again, where users keep squirreling special information away to other places, which leads to massive challenges in terms of people being assured that what they've got is the truth. The inconsistent application of metadata also negatively impacts on these search results. Now, Syntex is great because it's promising to help address some of these issues, and Mark's been talking about some of those. But from my perspective, there we go. It can trying to be smart, but I'm not very good at doing both talking and speak and my hands. It can directly support some of our governance challenges that we are facing by providing standard ways to describe and manage our information, identify our critical information and the critical elements of that information, as well as automatically applying metadata and controls, as sensitivity labels and retention labels. And through that, indirectly, it is then supporting some of the improved assurance. So, if we've got better standards, better metadata standards, better governance controls, then invariably you have the knock-on effect of having a slightly more assurance that the system and your organization is meeting both your privacy and compliance obligations, as well as better supporting e-discovery. But as Mark says, all of this comes at a cost still. It is providing a fantastic opportunity, but we mustn't be mistaken in thinking that this happens all automatically. There are some absolutely essential building blocks that need to be undertaken to support the magic of Syntex, all of which need to be undertaken before we start creating our models. One of these, or two of these, is really around retention and sensitivity labels. So to apply content compliance and governance elements, organizations need to ensure that they have a records retention schedule and translated into retention labels, as well as have defined their sensitivity labels. In order to do this, this means that you need to have already identified your content, understand its value, identify any legal and regulatory obligations required for both its retention and its protection. Now, there's some good news on the other side of this, which is actually the definition of syntax types is functionally based. So, which is also the basis for defining retention and sensitivity labels. At the end of the day, the content, it subject of the content, if you like, drives your governance your governance rules, as well as then the syntax rules in terms of being able to apply your metadata. So it's a very good fit together, and Microsoft, I think, has been incredibly smart and helpful by combining both the addition of metadata as well as the application of retention and sensitivity labels. Werner,
Yeah,
you have a question.
Yeah, so am I to understand that because syntax is smart, after you've trained it, is smart, uses AI, if you have your information governance arranged and you have those retention labels, you can actually, it understands if you upload a document into a location somewhere, and even without applying metadata, it's smart, it knows it's this type of document, an invoice or something. It'll find the information, it could automatically apply the metadata and start, so to say, the process of whether it's a record, what the retention rules are, the other requirements, regarding this document.
That's right. So when you're applying your content type and you're saying that this is the metadata I want associated with this content type,
yeah.
You can then say associated with that content type, therefore, is this particular retention label. So in other words, I mean, the easy one is around, say, invoices. I want to keep my invoices for 7 years. So if you're saying this particular content type is an invoice content type, therefore it's kept for 7 years, and how you define that label, which is a process that you do within the compliance center, you can then apply that to that content type, which would then automatically apply the retention.
Well, it saves a lot of work. That saves really a lot of work for a lot of people.
Yeah, but it's better than what we currently have, which is people not applying retention or poorly applying retention. So what we are doing within Syntex is actually you've got all the work up front, which then takes the user burden away further down the line. But I think that the challenge is always that we need to make sure that we're not, we're not shortcutting that front piece of work, really.
No. You need the information governance and information architecture in place actually to be able to do this automatically.
To do this automatically, exactly. So, I think that if organizations, as Mark had said already, if we've already got content types there, you've already got range sensitivity labels, you're great because you're a step forward. So then you start thinking, well, my retention labels are functionally based. And if I'm thinking, I've already got content types that are functionally based, you can then start working the two together quite well. But if you don't have any of that, if you've not applied retention labels, or you don't have a retention schedule that is up to date or easily applicable in SharePoint, because the issue is that I've come across is most organizations have very complicated retention schedules, but that they are there, which don't translate very easily into SharePoint. So there is a balance here in terms of how to do that, and there's an internal conversation that needs to happen with that. So the other building block for me is around, and Mark's already mentioned some of the architecture and the metadata. But for me, while Syntex enables the automated tagging and eliminating some of the user effort at the document ingestion and at creation, there's still an ongoing governance and management role behind that to ensure that there is enterprise-wide consistency around content types, around defined columns and taxonomy use. There is an ongoing requirement for curation, management, and sunsetting even, that didn't slip off the tongue, through the managed metadata service, because terms come and go as well. So while, and I think this is one of the important messages, is that AI doesn't eliminate the need for information architects and the governance, but actually brings it to the fore. But it also means, and this is the bit that I think I'm really excited about, and because it's a great direction of travel, is that actually it means that organizations can put it to its best use. So you're doing the back-end value add work to take away burden from the business, rather than sitting in the front feeling like you are adding a burden to the business. So there is Microsoft in the explanation and the support around Syntex recognizes a key role of knowledge manager, and they describe the role as the ability, the requirement to gather use cases and establish business processes. But actually, what they've completely missed is the ongoing maintenance and oversight that's required behind it. Because as Mark said earlier, it's absolutely not going to look after itself. You do need a light touch oversight and overview. And then just my final point that I'd like to make around this is that, I think there are a couple of considerations, and a number of considerations really, that we believe that organizations should bear in mind in order to realize the full potential and the full business benefit of Syntex, because there's massive business benefits, but we've got to put in some work in order to deliver those. And it's really around, consider what is your strategy and approach for integrating Syntex with the existing implementation. Mark's already mentioned some of this, where, I think for a long time, organizations are going to be operating in a hybrid environment of, Syntex being applied to some elements of documents and not to other elements of, and not to other documents and content types. And you really would be looking at Syntex to be a vehicle to manage your high volume, repeatable business, your high value content. So you want to look at your golden egg and leave the rest of it, which means that you could actually lead to an increase in siloism and some areas that are really well structured in your platform, but other areas that are less so. So this mixed environment, one's going to have to think about how you're going to manage it, how you're going to square those circles. The other side is that Microsoft hasn't entirely resolved some of the challenges around retention. They seem to indicate that retention is applied through, date last used or, date created. But actually, most of the retention rules are around event-based triggers. So in other words, when I've left the organization, or when a contract ceases, is the retention date, and applying that in SharePoint is still quite tricky. We've already mentioned the considering your approach to standardizing and governing your metadata. Often you'll find a number of teams using the same type of information, but they'll be viewing it from different lenses. So how do you ensure that the metadata values and the descriptor terms that are used actually meet the needs of both teams with their different viewpoints? So there is a requirement to do some mediation and some curation to ensure that the metadata values meet the needs of everybody who might need to access that content. And then the other side is that designing taxonomic terms needs to take into account and guard against unwitting and unhelpful biases, because the way you describe something provides a bias to that content as well. And that's something that one needs to think about. The other side is around business ownership. I mean, in my experience, organizations really struggle with getting the business to, to own the content, to take accountability. Now, if we're using artificial intelligence to automatically tag, you're taking away some of the activities from the business, which is great because they're not doing it anyway. So do we mind? But the other side is that if you still need the business to own it, because you need business areas to review the content types and the metadata values that have been assigned, and to make sure that they keep up to date, because they're not going to keep themselves up to date. And then the last point is around the other file formats in SharePoint. Cortex is looking at Microsoft file formats, but most organizations, in my experience, have a large number of other file formats. And I'm not sure where the roadmap is with being able to use Cortex to apply to that. So I think that there's still some work to be done there. And, you know, finally, just a final thought from my perspective as an information governance specialist is that while there will be both technical and cultural challenges to, you know, to implement Syntex, it's such a great step forward for information management, because it's really been evident, you know, that for years that traditional information management doesn't work as it should. And it's really needed AI and automation at scale to provide and to remove some of that business burden. And Syntex is really offering that opportunity. And it's certainly one that I would like to take advantage of.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nolien.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. That's the thing. I know exactly what you mean. I mean, at some point, it's going to be a sort of a hybrid solution also. So you'll have like two information architectures or two governances. One of them dealt with the traditional perspective, and one is the automated one, where indeed ownership. That's really something.
But you need to not have two governances. You need a unified governance approach, but accept the fact that potentially there's two tracks. Because let's be honest, a lot of what people put into a document management solution, SharePoint, is often also transient. So not everything that people put in is, you know, great and should be looked after. You know, it doesn't necessarily always have high value. So I think that, you know, this is back to people actually considering some of the value of their content.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an argument in the way Syntex works to say that your very high value metadata rich content could have Syntex applied to it. And as you said, Nolien, so things which are slightly more ephemeral and less important, you might want to not apply Syntex over them straight away. So I think that's true. I mean, the other thing that I think it's worth pointing out is, so if you look at the machine learning research, in general, again, this is a bit of a simplification, but in general, human beings are as good at tagging documents as machine learning is. But actually, they have different failures. Human beings are very accurate, but they're very inconsistent. But the great thing about something like Syntex is it's incredibly consistent. And again, the key word which I've mentioned, which Nolien's mentioned, is at scale. A human being would never be able to tag at the scale that Syntex can. So while Syntex might be deficient in some areas, actually applying to wholesale areas of your content, if you have information architecture, means you've got a really good chance of actually leveraging the value of that information.
Cool.
So do we want to open this up to the floor? You know, I don't know, thoughts, comments from
inquiries.
Inquiry, you know,
or more considerations.
More considerations.
Maybe ones we didn't think of.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Or maybe a critical note. Maybe somebody says, I don't see it as a step forward.
Yeah, Ray Walters has got an interesting question in the instant chat, talking about integration of Syntex and search refiners. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that you could see how the metadata that Syntex that automatically discovers could be absolutely applied to search refiners. Search is, in my experience in Microsoft 365, is a bit strange because it's a bit of a moving target, and Microsoft is spending a lot more time trying to make search better. So it would be interesting to see whether the search improves, given that Syntex is coming along. I don't know, actually, Vern, have you got any particular thoughts on that?
Yes. Actually, I know I've followed a couple of those seminars that Microsoft gives during the Christmas holidays, and actually they are indeed looking at search as the main engine. So the artificial intelligence was, of course, the big thing, the renewal, but optimizing and improving on search is the #1 priority now, to get that main engine running over everything. So what they've neglected over the last years indeed is the proper and easy way to make search refiners from any type of metadata, right? It is possible, it's cumbersome, but now with the integration of Syntex and the other Cortex products, because there's going to be more products coming from Project Cortex, so the tagging, for example, within emails, which hopefully everybody's seen in those promo videos. So that all leans on search, on the search index or the search engine that's running, and that needs to be properly filled and properly indexed and use the correct algorithm to work. And actually that's also something where I even believe that information architecture and information governance comes to play, because you need to connect all those data sources, right, to search, and then the artificial intelligence will pick that up from the search engine, and then hopefully will indeed allow quickly to have those refiners integrated properly. And then I'd almost say, since it's artificial intelligence, dynamically. So what they've shown us, what they can do with topics and words, they could also do that with those search refiners. So depending on the content you get back, right, it understands what you're looking for. So if it's invoices, so you'll get the proper refinements for those.
But Werner, that also links in with topics, isn't it? Because I mean, Microsoft, as part of Cortex, are bringing out topic identification, which is, I mean, they're really seen as part of their knowledge management offer, connecting people to content. I mean, that's where we're going. Yeah. And frankly, from my perspective, then using metadata and being able to extract that by way of accurate search is part of that connectivity as well, and that integrated requirement.
Yeah, so that's also the one thing. So as Mark also nicely pointed out, there is more work to be done now at the start, and that's also true for the search. So we need to be able to feed search the proper information. Oh, sorry, can't. Proper information to actually make search, and in this case also Syntex, and then also any other topic or any other product coming from Cortex, make it more I would almost say user-friendly. The whole idea of IT is, of course, to make things easier for everybody. It's to work with, right, and to help you. So, yeah.
So Brian, I think, has a question.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
So, hello. We are obviously a Microsoft Office 365 customer, and we are in the process of a Microsoft Dynamics implementation, and that includes project operations, their latest enterprise project management, which incorporates PSA. We're also doing field service, sales. It's a pretty ambitious project, and Dynamics out of the box has a pretty limited document management story with its integration into SharePoint. So we're utilizing a fair amount of Power Automate and SharePoint interfaces to kind of fill the gaps. Without getting too deep into the weeds, one of the things we're doing is we're leveraging a lot of metadata upstream from within Dynamics to write to SharePoint columns and whatnot. So we're getting like project numbers, client information,
right?
Identifying it's an invoice all upstream. So one of the things with Cortex, it's not clear to me, is Cortex kind of like an after the fact concept, meaning I wasn't able to retrieve my metadata upstream. I didn't have that luxury, or I wasn't interested in performing it upstream. So now I'm going to do it after the fact. So and maybe I'm reading it wrong, but in a scenario like ours, if we're able to capture it upstream in our line of businesses, is that still going to be best practice, or is there scenarios where we would still leverage Cortex to do kind of post-processing to tag additional items? So you would maybe do a combination of both.
I think you've just answered the question. I think it's going to be a combination of both. I mean, so what you're saying there is you've got pretty good metadata curation. So that really highlights the point I was talking about. So if you've got a good information architecture, and it sounds like you have, then how do you actually leverage Syntex to work with it, to augment it, improve it, rather than the model whereby you start from scratch? So I think Syntex could be used in either mode. I suspect that Syntex will really come into its own when it builds on existing information architecture, because I still don't believe that a human being can be bettered in terms of the broad understanding of your contents. Yes, doing the detail, doing the tagging at scale, syntax comes in, but I think a human being has to define the initial high-level information architecture, and it sounds like that's what you've done. So I'm waffling a bit now. So I would imagine syntax could be used to augment what you've already created.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then kind of the second half of that is we're an engineering company. We've got like 30 terabytes of engineering documents in our file servers. And there's a lot of interest to migrate some of that, the higher priority items, up into SharePoint. And I definitely think syntax could be a big part of that story, because that's not a Power Automate job there.
No.
Yeah, and if you've got engineering content, some of engineering content is full of very specific jargon, which I'm sure syntax would be very easy to very readily extract.
You definitely want to focus on your high value content. Because I mean that's the content that you want to find and extract. The problem at the moment is that because it's not, because it's sometimes difficult to find, you've got all this noise of junk. Well, not junk, important user information that is not necessarily always.
I know what you're saying.
We actually have the same at the current clients. We have the same issue. We have the 72 terabytes. It's millions of records, and they're actually struggling with because they don't have the proper information architecture in place. Although they thought they did, but it was up to a certain level, and after that level, it becomes messy. So for them it's really difficult to find the high value and the lower value documents and actually make that split. So what do we keep, what do we put where, to what do we apply indeed retention label, because also syntax will only do as it has been trained to do. So I think it's always a combination of
of both. And I think that this is the challenge, is that organizations have tried to look after all their information, but actually it's the value of the content and the subject of the content that defines your controls. So actually you need to be able to sift that out. So there is almost a piece, if you're going to be doing this, there is a piece of, let me understand my let me understand the value of my content, and let me find the high value that is also repeatable. That's where the documents look the same or they're going to have similar elements. I mean, I know Microsoft keeps using things like contracts and invoices as their examples, and they're great, they are right, but they're easy ones. There's most of the organizations that I come in contact with have got content that's valuable, that's not quite so easy to identify. And so I think that there is some navel gazing required in the organization, if you like, to actually consider what is the value, and and start with something but finite. Try and find out how, and think about how it fits with your current SharePoint implementation, and then take that forward, because that'll give you better use cases to then carry on building and applying.
All right.
So I think there's a few people needing to come off, saying cheerio. I know, Mark, I'm sorry, there is no magic, I'm afraid.
Yeah, we've filled up the whole hour, guys. So very good. Maybe we can go on. If anybody has anything to answer to question, now is the time before we drop off.
Yeah, or I'd be interested. I don't know whether this comes from the poll, Purdy, but I'm interested to see what everybody's thoughts or interests are in actually syntax or Cortex, and actually also in information governance, right? So because, we can talk about it.
It was actually all of the above, but I'll show you.
Yeah, all of the above. There you go. Yeah, exactly.
Good stats.
That's
yeah, I can. So for the people who are interested, everybody was eating too much. Almost everybody.
So we've got a quick question actually from Brian again, which is all of Cortex out or just Syntex?
Currently, it's just Syntex. The remainder of Cortex, yeah, they're looking into it on getting it rolled out to partners everywhere. But it's not. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. Hopefully in Q1 this year. Yeah. Not to mention the pricing model.
Yes.
Yes,
Well,
you have
yeah.
to pay for it. Yeah, got to pay for it.
You do have to pay at the moment, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's
Good point.
Honestly, that's with the best software and also with the best hardware even, right? At the beginning, they're very expensive, and the more people using it, right, and see the added value, because it does have a lot of added value. Don't be mistaken. Right? I mean, it does require work, and especially upfront, but for the pioneers, it will be pricey. It will be more work for everybody who is like, all right, I'll let them figure it out first, and we'll just go through the mud for the coming 5 years first, and then we'll see. Yeah, it's going to be cheaper. It's going to be cheaper, but I'd like to be the pioneer. If I
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to get my hands on plane and
Yeah.
design some stuff. Definitely, because I truly am excited by the opportunity, just because, yeah, you know what I feel about information management, being one. So I think this is a really, really important opportunity.
Yeah, it's also good that we do these things together, because I think then from our perspective, the migration and the connection, of course, and analysis of the content you already have in different formats, and how to put that indeed into the architecture within Syntex and Cortex, or actually within SharePoint or Teams, everything in that sense, what Microsoft considers content. Yeah, that's also going to be a toughie. That's also going to be interesting on working with that. Yeah.
Brian, thank you very much. You just asked about reaching out, and I think, Purdy, we just want to let everybody know that we are going to send the slides out with our contact details and also the recording. Is that right?
That's totally right. There's only a few people in the call, but for who's in the call still, you will receive an email with the recording of this session and also the slides, and that will probably be tomorrow morning or maybe tonight. Yeah, so I think that's also maybe a cue to stop today. I think we could go on for hours. I know, Werner, you can go on for hours.
You haven't got me started.
So I wanted to thank you all for your presentations. I saw it's food for thought, so that's good. Maybe we could do it as a second time to do a sort of a catch-up round. What's the status now of Syntex in a couple of months? Yeah, so whoever who's still in our meeting, thanks for joining us, and maybe see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.